Nate here. I know, the struggle is real. Not when everything is necessarily going right, but in those quiet moments when you're tired, you're off schedule, you're jet lagged, and no one would blame you for taking the easy way out. Because those are the moments when people fold. That's when they get rid of the fundamentals that ultimately keep them on track. They skip the workout, they say, I'll just start tomorrow, and they convince themselves that it doesn't really matter what decision they make in that moment. But what if those exact moments are the ones that define your level of self-respect? They're not the big wins, maybe not the public victories, but the small, invisible decisions when you are just versing you. And today, that's exactly what we're going to break down. But before we get into this episode, if you're into honest, unpolished conversations about success and real transformation, the kind that happen when nobody's watching, you can finally come to the right place, because that is habitual growth. And that is because discipline isn't punishment. It's actually proof of how much you respect your future self. So if you've ever found yourself in that mental battle, knowing exactly what you need to do, but still not doing it, then this episode is going to be for you. Just hit subscribe. And it's totally fine if you just know that somewhere in the near future, there's a slightly more disciplined version of you shaking their head and judging you because you didn't hit subscribe while doing the push-ups that you promised you'd start one day. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Habitual Growth Studio. I've got Lisa back in from overseas and then New Jersey. So she's super pumped to be back to continue our topics around discipline is a form of self-respect. And if you remember from last time, if you haven't listened to the last episode, make sure you go back and do that because there's a lot of great stuff in there. And this is kind of the second step of that, which is continuing to understand that what you do in private is the most impactful thing that you can do. How when you shift your identity into somebody who continues to follow their word and set up boundaries for discipline, it ultimately leads you to unshakable confidence as you move forward. And that's super important as we talk about discipline as a form of self-respect, because as I mentioned last time, it's complete juxtaposition to how most people actually view self-respect. And instead of seeing it's a punishment and I have to avoid all these things, it becomes an empowerment step of these are the things that I am absolutely going to do because this is who I am. And things like social media really cut away at our ability to perform, not just in the public space, but also most importantly in the private space. And I would say, Lisa, with your recent traveling, you have also mentioned how difficult sometimes it is for you when you get up and you have to perform when you're don't get any breaks. You're walking off a plane and you just had a complete time zone shift, and now you have to perform in the meetings in front of a team that hasn't seen you in so long. But what does that mean when it comes to basically your identity shift, but most importantly, working on the things behind the scenes, not just for social media and the public view?
Yeah. I think, people assume that discipline is something that remains constant, right? That if you have a list of items that you commit to doing, that you replicate them every single day in the same capacity. And what I've learned over time is discipline is actually a mentality. It's less about the same things repeated to the same scale over and over, as rather it's what am I doing that's moving me towards my goals that are considered non-negotiable. So, for example, European travel is really hard, right? So for me, I get on a plane. As soon as I land, I hit the ground running and it's nonstop for days, right? So there's not much time. So never mind the jet lag and the nutrition that's different. Timing is different, but workouts look different. I don't have an hour and a half to 2 hours every single day to hit the gym before I, meet with customers or at the end of the day because I've now got a customer dinner, right? Discipline in that capacity around my fitness routine looks like, can I commit to 3 workouts, half hour to an hour during this week that I'm there? Because that's feasibly what I can do to maintain discipline and still move me forward. And likewise, foods might be different. So it's harder for me to bring my protein powder along and, count every single macro as much as it is, can I choose the best possible option that keeps me as close to my goals as possible during this period of travel for me? And so that's a silly example, but it's demonstrating that you can have discipline around protecting what you can as it relates to the goals that you want. And it's less about me saying 6 days a week, I'm going to work out an hour and a half and I'm going to hit 180 grams of protein every single day, non negotiable, no matter what.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's why it really does start with identity. And I know if people have been listening to us for a while, this can sound a little bit redundant because we have talked about this subject before. But it is an important reminder that truly identity, even if you don't think you're there, but you are still working to become that person, is so important and why it's so foundational. Because, as an example, when you shift discipline from just sheer willpower, you're building this core identity of somebody who consistently follows through and learn to prioritize things that are more important than your comfort or even instant gratification. As an example, like you were just saying, of like, I'm my non-negotiables are these workouts. Well, that's because you're a person who is in shape. You're a person that follows through. You're a person that, wants to be an inspiration for other people. And sometimes we forget every thought process that we have, every action becomes a quote unquote like vote for the person that we have committed to be. And when you do follow through on that, because you have shifted your into that person, it does leak into all other aspects of your persona. So, your relationships, your professional career, your fitness, your spirituality, whatever it is, it doesn't just stay in one single form of where you're at. Like you mentioned, protein powders and, getting your proper grams of protein in your workouts. That's great for the physical, but that also then does correlate as well to the commitments that you're making to your kids and the commitments that you're making to your husband or your colleagues, the way that you actually manage. And I think sometimes it feels so isolated because it is a specific thing of, it's fitness related or whatever, but it actually does parlay into so many other aspects of life.
Yeah. And I talk about with the leaders on my team a lot, right? So, what standards are we trying to raise and how are we setting the examples as leaders? Because just speaking the words and talking the talk does not carry the same weight as people actually seeing you do the work in the way that you have talked about. And so, in order to shift your discipline, you have to be willing to shift your identity and you have to be willing to do it in a way that's consistent across all areas of your life so that people eventually come on board and say, Lisa is a person who follows through no matter what it is that she's working towards. So I know based on historical or by watching her or whatever, if she says she's going to do something, she's going to put in the work. She's going to find solutions to make it happen. She's going to X, Y, and Z. And that's super important because when you start to create that feedback loop essentially for yourself, this is a person that I'm committed to being. These are the actions that I'm going to show consistently. Other people see it and now follow. That actually then reinforces for you, again, your confidence that the discipline is working, the investment that I'm putting in is changing and creating this version of me that I want and that will continue to evolve in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Oftentimes, and I want to take that and kind of move that to the next step. So, really step one is identity, like shifting your identity, at least defining it and working towards that every single day. The second one, and oftentimes I think discipline isn't necessarily thought of in the same capacity as boundaries. And I know, again, we've talked about this in the past, but bringing this together, step two really is being disciplined, showing yourself self-respect by setting boundaries around what your discipline is, because it's actually more exhausting. And numerous studies have proved this across the board. It's actually more exhausting to work in a kind of FOMO mentality. I've got to appease this person. I've got to go, hang out with this friend group. Oh no, I've got to get up early and, do my work before my presentation is due in a couple of hours, right? When you have weak boundaries, you often are led to like emotional exhaustion. We hear work-life balance. A lot of those, I think, lines are blurred between professional time and personal time. And quite frankly, you run into exhaustion and burnout because you're not actually protecting your time, your mentality, and your energy. And so when you take your identity and you protect it with boundaries, it has been shown that you have much more significant impacts long term in your self-awareness, your self-discipline, and your self-respect because you're not guilted into these false boundaries. You are constructing them based on your identity.
Yeah. I was on a coaching call yesterday and it wasn't specifically related to creating discipline. It was around team performance, but I'll use the tool here because I think it also applies to understanding boundaries when it comes to your own goals and your own discipline. And it was essentially creating a four quadrant. On the y-axis is, things I like to do. So let's say highly related to my goal, and then, value that it brings me. So is on the x-axis. And so when you map your days, how much are you spending in the right upper quadrant, which is I really enjoy it. It's tied to my goals and it brings value to where I want to go. Obviously the other side is, the far left is I hate doing it and there's little to no value. So you can map that to your own self goals is I hate doing it and it's not related to my goals. Those things should come off your plate. Those should be the boundaries that you start to set because they are not moving you forward to the person that you want to be in the future. And you actually don't even enjoy them, right? And then spending your time on more of the right side of the quadrant, which is what are the activities, the actions, the time investments that I really enjoy, or maybe I don't enjoy as much, but they are moving me at a much faster pace towards the person that I want to become or the goals that I've set. And doing that mapping a few times can help you understand where you need to maybe put some boundaries to protect the high value activities versus where you might enjoy something and let's say it's not really moving you forward towards your goals, but you can sprinkle it in a little bit because it does bring you joy or happiness or, you really enjoy whatever it is with family and friends.
Yeah, I love that quadrant example because it's important to note for people as well. Like oftentimes they look at high performers and it seems like they've got their entire life like figured out, right? But going back to what we talked about last week, it's one thing to have a social media highlight reel versus another thing, which is like doing the right thing when nobody can actually see. Like you're still in your private life, in your own time with your, close relationships, your partners, your families, your kids, your business partners, whatever it is, like you are actually doing the things that really do matter when nobody is looking. And oftentimes with that quadrant, and the reason I want to touch on that is I think it's easy for people to say, well, that guy's got his professional career really figured out, or that woman really has her relationships and she's the perfect parent, not realizing how much of that is self revisiting conversations, right? Looking at how far you've come, where maybe your boundaries have eroded, because almost every single person who is successful has some other part of their life that is not as structured, that is not as boundary specific. So as an example, right, like Elon Musk, people love the guy because he's, a tech genius. He's doing things nobody else in the history of mankind has been able to do, but he probably doesn't have the best family life, right? He's probably not the most spiritual person because he is working 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. That's his chosen life. But a lot of people don't want to be that extreme, right? So you want to constantly reevaluate where you're putting your time, your energy, and your resources. And it's okay if some of these areas of your life erode. But like you said about the matrix, when you go back and you're actually looking at, am I really enjoying this? Am I doing this for a reason? Am I getting value out of this? And you're doing that over a period of time, it allows you to then reset boundaries in other areas of your life so that you are consistently moving forward in a holistic and self-trusting way.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And maybe here's another silly example if people are visual like I am is, when you think about your day, you've got 16 hours if you're an 8-hour night sleeper to define where you spend your time and where you want to build your boundaries around. For people that are high performers or very aggressively attacking their goals, it could be that 8 to 10 hours out of that 16 is completely focused to those activities and everything else in that time period is a no. And then you have, let's say, 4 hours that are kind of the things that you have to do or your social time or your family time and you build that in. And then there's a very small percentage of just, it is what it is. Maybe it's travel in the car or, that you can't really slot in a bucket. But if you start to think and map out your days in terms of where do I want to go? How much time am I willing to invest? What boundaries do I need to create to keep that time sacred to be able to move it forward? And then where are the other smaller pieces that I still want to do or have to happen? And what percentage of my time is there? And that's something that's very personal to people. And they have to figure out, to your example with Elon Musk, he's probably much higher in the innovation, moving my job forward, career growth, change the world type thing than maybe you or I, but
Yeah.
we're close second. But it's a good touch point too. So if you do the quadrant exercise and then you say, here's where I want to spend my time, then how do I structure my days in a way that I can build boundaries around them, that I can create the habits and discipline required to move me forward as fast as possible?
Yeah. Well, and that's it. And that it's moving it forward as fast as possible with a little bit of self-awareness because it is the long-term games. And that's the third step that you're touching on, which is the first, identity shift, the second, protecting your discipline with boundaries, and then the third is giving it enough time so that your discipline does build unshakable self-respect. And last week we touched on a Dudine study, which let's bring up again, but they were able to show clear data that when you have, especially as a child, high levels of self-control, predicted to have much fewer health problems, like by almost 3x, less substance dependency, better financial stability, actually slower biological aging, which I think is really interesting, by up to 1.5 to 2 years, and just higher life satisfaction over the course of a couple of decades. And those are meaningful numbers when you, quite frankly, get to like our age. You look for different things in life that you want to have stability in. You want the right finances. You want to be able to say no. You don't want to chase FOMO every time. You don't want to have addiction or substance abuse. And these things, when you are able to have that discipline early on and sustain it through your boundaries, that's what gives you that ultimate unshakable self-respect when we talk about discipline and why it's so important in life as you continue to grow throughout your professional or personal careers.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think this was a great topic. Hopefully it helped people, especially with our silly examples of quadrants and breaking up your day. But it really is that setting your identity, building your boundaries, and then allowing the time and the discipline to be able to foster and grow, and build the habits that will ultimately are required for success.
That's it. All right. Well, with that, I know you've got a lot on your plate today, so let's wrap it up there. And we're going to be in the studio next week again. So audience, thank you for tuning in. Like, subscribe. If this was helpful, share to anybody that you know, and then join us next week when we drop the next version of Raising Your Standards.
That's awesome. Good to see you,
All
Nate.
right.
Have a nice
Yeah.